30,000 pounds. That's the number in the title that brought you here. But here's the thing, before we go any further, I need to correct that number because getting this wrong is exactly how a channel ends up spreading misinformation. And I'm not going to do that to you. The actual strikes on Iran's missile infrastructure used a different bomb entirely. And the real story is honestly more interesting than the inflated version. A 15-fold difference, hiding in plain sight in a headline nobody bothered to check. Stick with me, because by the end of this video you'll understand exactly which bomb hit what, and why the difference actually matters. Welcome back to the channel. Quick background for anyone new here, I spent years flying the F-15E Strike Eagle in combat, flew the F-16 with the Air Force Thunderbirds, and these days I fly commercial jets, the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. Every fact in this video is checked against CENTCOM's own statements, Army Recognition, the War Zone, USNI News, Air and Space Forces Magazine, ABC News, and USA Today, and I correct the record the moment a popular claim doesn't hold up. Let's get into it. 2 different bombs, 2 different targets, 2 different months. That's the actual story hiding behind this title, and almost nobody covering it separates the two clearly. Let's start with the real 30,000-pound strike first, because it happened, it's fully confirmed, and it's genuinely one of the most significant airstrikes in modern history. It just didn't hit a missile factory. According to detailed reporting from USNI News, on the night of June 21st into June 22nd, 2025, 7 B-2 Spirit bombers dropped 14 GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators on Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities at Natanz and Fordo. That same reporting confirms the weapon's actual specifications. The MOP is a 20-foot-long, 30,000-pound munition capable of tunneling through more than 100 feet of concrete, and it's considered the only weapon in the American arsenal capable of reaching a facility buried as deep as Fordo. A third site, Isfahan, was struck separately using more than 30 Tomahawk cruise missiles fired from a submarine, not the MOP itself, because even a bomb that powerful reportedly wasn't guaranteed to reach everything buried under that specific location. Only the B-2 can carry it. Gulf News' own breakdown of the hardware involved fills in why that specific aircraft was the only option. Built by Northrop Grumman, the B-2 Spirit is described as the world's most advanced stealth bomber, with a radar-evading design that allows it to fly deep into enemy territory undetected, making it specifically suited to striking fortified underground targets. That same reporting confirms the B-2 can carry over 40,000 pounds of munitions total, including the 30,000-pound GBU-57, and has a range of more than 6,000 nautical miles, meaning it can take off from American soil and reach virtually any target on the planet with aerial refueling support along the way. No other aircraft in the world, American or otherwise, can carry that specific weapon, which is exactly why every single strike involving the MOP in this war, or any future one, has to run through the tiny fleet of available B-2s. Fordo itself deserves a moment of specific attention here, because understanding exactly what that facility is tells you why this particular weapon was considered absolutely essential rather than simply preferred. According to earlier reporting on the build-up to this strike, Fordo's fuel enrichment plant sits encased in steel more than 300 feet beneath solid rock, roughly 125 miles from Tehran. Israel's own Air Force, despite everything it had already accomplished in this war, reportedly lacked any bunker buster in its arsenal heavy enough to seriously threaten that specific facility, which is precisely why American involvement, and specifically this one weapon, became the central question hanging over the entire war in its earlier phase. 300 feet of rock is genuinely hard to picture in the abstract, so let me put it in terms that might land better. That's roughly the height of a 30-story building, except instead of standing above ground where you could look up and see it, that entire depth is solid rock and reinforced overburden sitting directly on top of the target, with the enrichment halls themselves buried at the very bottom of it. No conventional bomb, and until the MOP existed, no bomb in any nation's arsenal could realistically be expected to punch through that much material and still detonate with enough remaining energy to actually destroy what was underneath. That's the specific engineering problem the Massive Ordnance Penetrator was built to solve, and it's exactly why, for years before this war ever started, American and Israeli defense planners treated Fordo as the single hardest nut to crack in the entire Iranian nuclear program. Here's a detail that genuinely surprised me researching this. According to reporting from USA Today, it's unclear exactly how much a single MOP actually costs, but the contracts to produce them have run into tens of millions of dollars total, with Boeing winning a $70 million Defense Department contract back in 2019 to work on the weapon at its St. Louis facility, followed by an updated production contract worth more than $77 million in 2021, That same reporting confirms only the B-2 can carry this weapon, each bomber holding a maximum of 2, and the Air Force only ran 5 successful test drops of the bomb before this strike ever happened. At White Sands Missile Range back in 2012, 3 with live warheads and 2 inert, 13 bombers. Only 7 actually carrying bombs. ABC News' reporting fills in the mission profile itself, and it's genuinely one of the more remarkable deception operations in recent military history. A total of 13 B-2 bombers took off around the same time from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. 6 of them flew west, toward Guam, as decoys. The other 7 quietly headed east, toward Iran, with minimal communication, specifically to avoid detection. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, confirmed this was the largest B-2 operational strike in U.S. history and the second longest B-2 mission ever flown, all 13 bombers making it back to Whiteman by early Sunday afternoon. Think about what that deception actually required operationally for a second, because it's easy to skip past a detail like that without appreciating the complexity behind it. You're not just flying 6 empty bombers in a random direction. You're coordinating radio discipline, flight profiles, and timing across 2 entirely separate formations, heading in opposite directions, while making sure neither group's movements give away the real target of the other. ABC News' own reporting notes. It wasn't even immediately clear afterward whether the bombers sent toward Guam ever actually landed there, which tells you the decoy mission itself was being run with the same operational secrecy as the real strike, right down to keeping outside observers guessing about its actual endpoint. More than 125 aircraft, not just 7 bombers. According to that same USNI news reporting, the group of 7 B-2s carrying the actual bombs flew a route over the Atlantic, across the Mediterranean, and into the Middle East, supported by a fleet of KC-135 and KC-46A Pegasus aerial refuelers that had been prepositioned in advance specifically to support that long-distance round trip. Once inside CENTCOM's area of operations, an unspecified number of 4th and 5th generation American fighters, most likely F-16s and F-35s according to Kane, joined the bombers before they crossed into Iranian airspace, sweeping ahead of the strike package to clear enemy fighters and surface to air missile threats before the B-2s themselves arrived over the target. I want to walk through why that fighter escort mattered specifically, because Iranian air defenses weren't a total unknown quantity by that point in the war. Israeli strikes had already been running against Iran since June 13th, roughly a week before this specific mission, which meant Iran's air defense network had already absorbed real damage before the American bombers ever crossed into its airspace. That earlier Israeli campaign functionally cleared a safer corridor for the B-2s to operate in, meaning this strike wasn't happening against a fully intact, fully alert air defense system. It was happening against one that had already been degraded by days of prior fighting, which is part of why a strike this deep and this complex was judged survivable enough to actually attempt. President Trump's own words that night became the defining phrase of this entire war. According to that same USNI reporting, he said Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities had been completely and totally obliterated. Kane's own assessment, somewhat more measured, described extremely severe damage and destruction at all 3 sites based on initial battle damage assessment. I've covered the ongoing dispute over exactly how much long-term damage that strike actually did in an earlier video on this channel, so I won't relitigate the full debate here, but I wanted you to have the accurate weapon details before we move to the second, entirely separate story your title is actually describing. Now here's where the real confusion starts, and where I think your title got its numbers crossed. Fast forward roughly 9 months to March 2026, well into the second, much larger phase of this war that began February 28th. According to detailed reporting from the specialist defense outlet Army Recognition, B-2 bombers struck Iran's underground missile launchers using a completely different weapon, not the 30,000-pound MOP, but dozens of 2,000-pound penetrator bombs as part of Operation Epic Fury. 2,000 pounds, not 30,000. That's a 15-fold difference in size, and it matters enormously for understanding what actually happened. That same Army Recognition reporting notes. CENTCOM only described these as 2,000-pound penetrating bombs without publicly confirming the exact designation. But public Air Force information points strongly to the GBU-57 Joint Direct Attack munition family, combining a 2,000-pound bomb body, commonly either the BLU-109 penetrator or the Mark 84, with a GPS and inertial guidance kit that converts an unguided bomb into a precision-guided munition accurate to within a few meters, even in bad weather. I want to walk through what JDAM guidance actually adds to a bomb like this, because it's easy to assume a bunker buster is just a big heavy chunk of metal, when the guidance package is honestly just as important as the warhead itself. Before GPS-guided kits like this existed, unguided bombs of similar size relied purely on the physics of a bomb dropped from a specific altitude and airspeed. meaning accuracy against a small, hardened target like a bunker entrance was genuinely difficult to guarantee, especially through cloud cover or in poor visibility. Strapping a GPS and inertial guidance kit onto that same 2,000-pound bomb body turns it into a weapon that can reliably land within a few meters of a programmed coordinate regardless of weather, which matters enormously when you're specifically trying to hit a bunker entrance or a narrow underground shaft rather than a large, sprawling target where a wider miss radius would still count as a hit. That inertial guidance component, specifically, is worth understanding a little further because it's what keeps the weapon accurate even in the rare cases where GPS signal itself gets disrupted or jammed. An inertial navigation system uses onboard sensors, tracking acceleration and rotation to continuously calculate the bomb's position relative to where it was released, essentially dead reckoning at extremely high precision, which means even if an adversary attempts electronic jamming against the GPS signal specifically, the weapon retains a fallback navigation method that keeps it reasonably close to its intended target. That kind of redundancy matters enormously in a contested electronic warfare environment like Iran, where both sides have been actively jamming and spoofing navigation systems throughout this war, a detail I touched on in an earlier video covering GPS spoofing affecting commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Here's why the smaller bomb actually makes sense for this specific target set, and it's a genuinely important technical distinction. According to that Army recognition analysis, the BLU-109 warhead is designed to penetrate several meters of reinforced concrete before detonating, which is more than sufficient for hardened shelters or bunker entrances, but it's nowhere near the penetrating power of the MOP, which was specifically engineered for something buried under more than 100 feet of rock like Fordo. The targets in this March strike, described by CENTCOM as part of Iran's underground missile network, are often referred to by analysts as missile cities, dispersed underground facilities built to shelter and launch ballistic missiles. Those facilities, while genuinely hardened, generally don't require the same extreme penetration depth as a facility purpose-built to survive exactly this kind of American airstrike, which is exactly why the 2,000-pound weapon was the right tool for that specific job rather than the much larger, much more expensive MOP. I also think it's worth explaining what a missile city actually is, because the term itself tells you something important about Iranian military doctrine that's been building for years, well before this specific war ever started. Iran has spent a considerable portion of its defense investment over the past 2 decades building out an extensive network of underground facilities specifically designed to shelter ballistic missiles from exactly this kind of airstrike, dispersing launch capability across multiple hardened hidden locations rather than concentrating it in a small number of easily targetable sites. That doctrine reflects a country that's assumed for years it would eventually face a serious American or Israeli air campaign and planned its missile forces accordingly, which is part of why identifying and striking that dispersed network became such a specific, sustained priority once this current phase of the war actually began. That dispersal strategy is worth sitting with for a second longer, because it's a genuinely different defensive philosophy than the one Iran used for its nuclear program. Fordo relied on extreme depth in a single, enormously fortified location, essentially betting that no weapon could ever reach it no matter how long a campaign lasted. The Missile City network takes almost the opposite approach, betting on quantity and dispersal rather than depth, accepting that any individual facility might eventually be found and struck, but ensuring enough redundant, geographically separated sites exist that no single strike, or even a sustained campaign of strikes, could plausibly eliminate the entire network in one operation. Understanding that difference in underlying strategy is part of why the 2,000-pound weapon made sense here, when your defensive doctrine relies on spreading risk across dozens of separate sites rather than concentrating survivability into one impossibly deep bunker. The attacking side doesn't need its heaviest possible weapon at every single location. It needs a weapon that's reliable, precise, and available in large enough quantities to work through that entire dispersed target list efficiently. The White House itself confirmed this specific strike publicly and specifically named the target category. According to reporting from Iran International, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters directly, quote, "The U.S. military is moving to dismantle Iran's missile production infrastructure. Our incredible B-2 bombers recently dropped dozens of 2,000-pound penetrator bombs on deeply buried missile sites." I want you to notice something in that quote. The White House itself used the phrase 2,000-pound penetrator bombs explicitly on the record, which makes the 30,000-pound figure in a title like this one factually incorrect for this specific strike, even though it's the exact right number for the earlier, separate nuclear strikes back in June of 2025. So does that mean 30,000-pound bombs never hit anything resembling a weapons production site? Actually, no, and this is where the story gets genuinely interesting again. According to reporting from the specialist military outlet The War Zone, just days after that missile site strike on March 12, 2026, B-2 bombers struck again, and satellite imagery from the commercial provider Vantor showed a site long linked to Iran's nuclear program had been hit. That same reporting notes a trio of very large impact points raised the real possibility that this specific facility, called Talagan 2, had actually been struck by the full 30,000-pound GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator after all. 3 craters. That's the actual physical evidence behind this specific claim. And it's worth understanding exactly how analysts reach a conclusion like this from satellite imagery alone without an official CENTCOM confirmation to lean on. Impact crater size and shape are genuinely diagnostic. A 30,000-pound MOP leaves a dramatically different signature than a 2,000-pound penetrator, both in the diameter of the surface disturbance and in how deep the surrounding ground appears to have been disrupted by the detonation happening well below the surface rather than near it. When specialist imagery analysts, the same kind of people who track military hardware professionally for outlets like the War Zone, look at that specific pattern and conclude it's consistent with the MOP rather than a smaller weapon. That's a technically grounded assessment, even without an on-the-record CENTCOM statement confirming the exact munition used. This is exactly the kind of open-source intelligence work that's become such a core part of how modern wars actually get documented and understood by the public. And it's worth appreciating for a second on its own terms. Commercial satellite imagery providers like Vantor operate entirely independently of any government, meaning their imagery isn't subject to the same selective release, classification, or public affairs framing that official military statements go through. When independent analysts working from that same commercially available imagery reach conclusions that align with, contradict, or add nuance to what a government has or hasn't officially confirmed, that process gives you a meaningfully more complete picture than relying purely on official statements alone, which is exactly why I've made a point throughout this video of naming which specific claims come from CENTCOM directly versus which come from this kind of independent satellite analysis instead. Talagan 2 is worth understanding specifically because it's not a missile factory in the conventional sense, it's something arguably more sensitive. That Warzone reporting notes the site had been newly encased in a concrete shell and then covered with soil in the months leading up to this strike, which may have created exactly the kind of need for a weapon capable of burrowing deeper that only the MOP could reliably provide. Other reporting on the same site has connected it to earlier Israeli strikes back in October of 2024, tied specifically to nuclear weapons, relevant research involving detonation components, which I touched on briefly in an earlier video on this channel about the fight over Iran's command structure. I think that concrete encasement detail deserves a second look because it tells you something important about the ongoing chess match between Iran's engineers and the American and Israeli intelligence tracking them. A facility getting a newly poured concrete shell and a fresh layer of soil cover in the months before a strike isn't a coincidence. It's a country actively reinforcing a specific site it clearly expects to be targeted again, based on its earlier history. That kind of visible reinforcement effort, and the corresponding decision to potentially use the full 30,000-pound MOP rather than a smaller weapon in response, mirrors almost exactly the same pattern I've covered in an earlier video on this channel regarding Pickaxe Mountain, Iran's deeper, more heavily fortified successor facility to Fordo, suggesting this specific cycle, Iran hardening a site, the U. Escalating its weapon choice in response, has repeated itself at multiple locations across this war rather than being unique to any single facility. So here's the honest, fully corrected version of your title, stated as precisely as the actual sourcing allows. The dozens of bombs that hit Iran's underground missile launcher network back in March were 2,000-pound penetrators, not 30,000-pound MOPs, confirmed directly by CENTCOM and the White House press secretary on the record. Separately, just days later, a strike on a different site, Talagan 2, tied to nuclear weapons, relevant infrastructure rather than missile production specifically, may have used the full 30,000-pound MOP based on satellite imagery analysis, though that specific munition wasn't officially confirmed by CENTCOM in the same on-the-record way the earlier strike was. Every additional 10,000 pounds costs you something real. Let me bring my own background into this for a second, because I think the actual military logic behind choosing different bombs for different targets is worth understanding on its own, beyond just correcting the number. As a pilot, target selection and weapon selection aren't separate decisions. They're the same decision. Every additional 10,000 pounds of bomb weight costs you range, costs you the number of weapons a single aircraft can carry, and costs you money, real money, tens of millions of dollars in production contracts for a weapon that only one aircraft type in the entire world can even carry. Using a 30,000-pound MOP on a target that a 2,000-pound penetrator could handle just as effectively isn't more impressive. It's actually a sign of poor planning, wasting an extremely limited, extremely expensive strategic asset on a target that didn't require it. The fact that planners specifically chose the smaller weapon for the missile launcher network and reportedly reserved the massive MOP specifically for the one target believed to need that extra penetration depth, tells you this was a deliberate, resource-conscious targeting decision, not an indiscriminate show of force. There's a supply chain reality behind this too that I think gets lost in the drama of a headline number. Every B-2 in the entire Air Force fleet, all 20 of them, represents an irreplaceable strategic asset that took years to build and can't simply be replaced on any short timeline if lost or damaged. Pairing that scarce aircraft with an equally scarce weapon, remember? Only a handful of MOPs were ever even test dropped before this war began. Means every single decision to actually employ one in combat carries real opportunity cost, using up a limited stockpile of a weapon that can't quickly be manufactured at scale, on an aircraft that can't quickly be replaced either. That scarcity is exactly why military planners have every incentive to reserve the MOP specifically for targets that genuinely require it, and to default to more available weapons like the 2,000-pound penetrator, whenever the target's hardness doesn't actually demand the bigger bomb. I also think this specific correction matters for a reason that goes beyond just getting the number right for its own sake. Titles that inflate a 2,000-pound strike into a 30,000-pound strike aren't just technically wrong, they actually undersell the real story. Because the real story is that the US military has been running two entirely separate, carefully calibrated bombing campaigns against two different categories of Iranian target: missile infrastructure using the more common, more available 2,000-pound penetrator, and the handful of truly hardened nuclear sites using the rare, expensive 30,000-pound MOP, switching between them based on what each specific target actually requires. That's a more sophisticated and honestly more impressive picture of American air power than a single inflated number gives you credit for. If you're finding this kind of careful, corrected breakdown valuable, that's exactly what I try to bring you on this channel. Not just repeating whatever number is trending, but actually checking it against CENTCOM's own statements and the specialist outlets that track this hardware for a living. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time, and turn on notifications. Because getting these specific details right, bomb by bomb, target by target, is exactly the kind of coverage I want this channel known for. Let me give you my honest read on where this actually sits. As someone who's spent a career around exactly this kind of weapons employment decision, I think the real lesson from correcting this title isn't just about one wrong number, it's about how war coverage in general tends to round everything up to the most dramatic possible version, because dramatic numbers get more attention than accurate ones. The actual American bombing campaign against Iran's missile infrastructure has been precise enough and resource conscious enough that planners have consistently matched weapon size to target hardness rather than defaulting to the biggest bomb available every time. And I think that precision is the more genuinely impressive story, even if it doesn't fit as cleanly into a single dramatic headline. Here's a number that actually puts this in perspective better than any single bomb's weight does. According to that USA Today reporting I mentioned earlier, only 5 MOPs were ever even test dropped before this war, and 14 were used in that single June 2025 strike alone, meaning this war has already consumed nearly 3 times the entire pre-war test history of that weapon in one night. That's the kind of number that tells you just how genuinely rare and strategically significant an actual confirmed MOP strike really is, which is exactly why I think it matters to get the distinction right between a 2,000-pound strike and a 30,000-pound one. Conflating the two doesn't just get a number wrong, it dilutes how rare and significant a real MOP strike actually is every time a smaller strike gets mislabeled as one. I also think there's a broader pattern worth naming here, one I've touched on in earlier videos covering this war. Nearly every escalation in this conflict, the bunker busters, the bridge strikes, the power plant threats, the ground operations planning, I covered in my last video, tends to get reported first in its most dramatic possible framing, before the more precise, more technical version of the story catches up days or weeks later. I think that's simply the nature of how fast-moving war coverage works online. The dramatic version travels faster than the careful one. My goal on this channel has consistently been to be the place you come back to for that second, more careful version, once the dust settles enough to actually check the sourcing properly. And I think this specific bomb size correction is a pretty clean example of exactly why that approach matters. I'll be tracking this specific thread closely, and if there's ever a confirmed, on the record use of the full 30,000-pound MOP against a genuine missile production facility specifically, rather than a nuclear site or the underground launcher network we've discussed today, I'll bring you a dedicated update the moment that's actually verified rather than assumed. If this video helped you understand the real hardware behind the headline instead of just the biggest possible number, that's exactly the goal here, and I'd really appreciate you sharing it with someone else trying to follow this war accurately. It's a small thing, one bomb's actual weight. But accuracy on the small things is exactly what separates a channel you can trust on the big things too. Hit subscribe if you haven't, and if you want deeper access, faster answers, and priority replies during live breakdowns, whenever something major develops in this conflict, come join the Ready Room. Links in the description below. Drop your questions in the comments. I read every single one, and I'll pull the best of them into the next update as this keeps developing. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.